Catching Tadpoles, and he's going to be talking to us about what inspired it, and we'll also talk a little bit about his journey in becoming a young rebel. Well, Ronnie, thank you so much for your time. Let's start off by looking at the title of the book, Catching Tadpoles. What inspired it?
Well, as a young kid, like so many others, I loved trying to catch those little tadpoles in garden ponds, and at first you would try and grasp at them. Impossible, they're mercurical and hard in recesses, until I learned to use a net.
Yes.
When it came to writing this book, I started with that memory and then used it as a metaphor for trying to catch the memories hidden in the recesses of my mind.
Let's talk about Yeoville, because that's how we started the introduction. Born in Yeoville, the Yeoville of your childhood, what was it like?
Well, to start off with, born in 1938, I mean, all the viewers, especially the younger ones, must realise that Johannesburg and its suburbs, like all the towns, cities of South Africa, were pure white abodes, and black people weren't living in them unless they were servants, domestic workers for white families, or messengers from the stores, whether it was downtown Joburg or a very Jewish neighbourhood like Yeoville, which was predominantly Jewish, immigrants, and we know it's full of immigrants today from Africa. Then the immigrants were largely from Eastern Europe, Lithuania, Latvian Jews, who had come in at the end of the 19th century, like my grandparents had. It was a lovely suburb with fantastic culture and activity and life.
One of the things you talk about in the book, which I loved because it focuses on the apartment block of flats where you lived and the hive of activity and the many people that you met. You talk about your neighbors. But the one group of people I found very interesting were the Sachs sisters, who lured you with a pitcher of lemonade. Tell me about the impression they had on you at the time.
Okay, well, you've really spotted these three sisters who suddenly people ask me about. I was only 10 years old, and the younger sister was my age, Fagi. Then she had a sister a couple of years older who was Minky, and then the sister I was in love with, 16-year-old Bella. She was an absolute beauty. They came from Eastern Europe as well, and they spotted me running around like a crazy kid in the suburbs as we played in those streets. And one day they lured me over, saying, "Hey, Ronnie, come over here, we want to talk to you." I was very shy and wasn't so ready to go through their gate and up onto their stoep, their balcony. But they had this picture of homemade lemonade, and they said, "Come on, have some of this and a slice of cake." And they got hold of me that way. And no sooner had I had the cake and the lemonade that they took me into the parlour, and the whole thing was that they wanted to teach the young sister my age how to dance. And Minky played the piano and Bella called out the steps, etc. And I then learnt how to waltz and foxtrot and even do a tango and dances like that. But they also were very knowledgeable about international events in a way that I wasn't, or the kids in the neighbourhood. They came from quite a political family, and in their parlour room there were photos of people like Stalin and the Russian leadership. This is just coming out of the war years. And they said to me, did I know that the Nazi party was coming to power in South Africa in the election. I said, "What is that?" And they said, "Don't you know the National Party, Dr. Verwoerd and others? These are terrible people. If they win the election," which was in May 1948, so I'm 10 years old, and very apolitical, we Jews are going to be kicked out of South Africa, and all the black people will be rounded up and put in concentration camps. camps like what happened to the Jews in Europe. And I said, what? I couldn't understand. And of course the nationalists came in. And they were weeping when that happened. They began talking about the Americans and the atomic bomb, soon the hydrogen bomb, and how America wanted to dominate the world and how America needed to be opposed, the role of Russia in defeating the Nazis during the war. So they filled me with lots of this information. It intrigued me and made me very interested in wanting to learn more.
The other person who intrigued you and, created that interest for you to want to learn more is a teacher by the name of Teddy Gordon. Because up until his first lesson on the French Revolution, you didn't pay much attention in class. But something changed in that class. What was it?
Yes. So you're right, this is when I'm about 16, entering the last couple of years of high school, King Edward's, close to Yeovil, but a bit upper class compared to Yeovil boys where I started life. And I was sports mad. I remember the day distinctly. I'm looking out of the window, daydreaming about sports. An upcoming rugby match or so, and I suddenly hear the word revolution out of the corner of my ear. By then I'd become something of a rebel against society without much clarity. I didn't like the authoritarianism of King Edward's School as an example, or of society as such. It was quite unconventional and thus rebellious, and I hear the word revolution, so that attracts me. And he says, boys, this term we're going to study the French Revolution. So now I'm paying attention. And he goes on to say the great slogan of that time was liberty, equality and fraternity. It still applies today. And we had a discussion about the meaning of that. And then the way he explained the conditions of the downtrodden serfs and landless people of France of 1789, the 18th century Europe, where the absolute monarchs ruled with total power. The nobles lived in absolute luxury while the people starved and were oppressed. And as he talked about it, he had to be careful. This is an apartheid police state, and a teacher has to be careful that he's not talking in too much of a left-wing communist way. But the way he spoke, I began to see the parallels between this oppression that had existed in France in the days before that revolution and South Africa. And that got me very interested in history. My marks took off. I became more interested in English literature because he was also an English teacher. And that began to really change me and turn me into a much more serious person.
Let's fast forward to the South Africa now, 2019, which is very different from the South Africa you grew up in, in your teenage years, your 20s and your 30s. Looking at the progress and the work that you've done in building South Africa and helping get to where it is, I'm sure there's a lot of young people who'd want to even sit with you for an hour or so to just pick your brain about various issues. Given that context, then, what do you think are some of the pressing issues that young people, would be interested in or would want answers to or should be curious about?
Sure. Can I just fill in a little bit of the history that from leaving school, and in this sense I would say it does apply to young people born frees in South Africa today, leaving school, looking for the meaning of life or simply what to do with their lives, and coming up against all sorts of very serious problems about the conditions, about whether they could get a job and so on. So in a sense what happens in the book is, as I leave school, I get involved outside my particular cocoon, this privileged white or Jewish community, and I began to relate to people across the colour line, and I saw how unjust the society was, and I wanted to know all South Africans, black and white, got very friendly with black South Africans and also mixed race people of all kinds, in order, well, because I was interested and I was drawn to them, but also to understand their lives and what's taking place in South Africa at that time, where the Sharpeville massacre takes place a couple of years after I leave school, and that is what impels me to act to make South Africa a free country. And it's then that I become involved in the liberation struggle, which I deal with in another book that I've written, Armed and Dangerous. Today, we don't have a need to join a struggle that's armed. We have a democracy, we can vote. A struggle that was with weapons to overthrow a government which only served white people. So it's very different. Everyone over the age of 18 has a vote today. We can vote for the government of our choice. And nevertheless, with all the constitutional rights and the Bill of Rights, which secure our freedom, we still see what's eluding us is equality, the distinction in a country between the very wealthy and those in poverty are extreme. It gives rise to all sorts of problems relating to economic growth on the one hand, but to questions of unemployment, poverty, the oppression of women, the gender issue, even though we say it's a non-racist, non-sexist democracy, but there's still huge areas of race prejudice and in fact racial oppression and victimization and loss of dignity and of course the abuse of women. So there is so many issues that face people, and I guess this is what you're saying. The youth today particularly, but anybody really who's unemployed and in poverty, or a woman who's feeling oppressed, but even somebody, whether it's white or black, who's got a decent job, there's still the spectre of indignities that take place, of is the future secure for our children. And I think that the book, in fact, although it deals with different questions in a different era, and I'm facing these questions and seeking resolution for them, what I'm striving to do is point out lessons of how life should be lived.
Well, that's a wrap from the News at 1 team. We're back tomorrow.